This video is brought to you by our up and coming strength and conditioning camp for athletes and coaches. You will be training from the 24th, 25th and 26th of May in Praia de Luz in the south of Portugal. Email us at sikastrength@gmail.com to sign up, where we'll teach you all we know about S&C strength training, take you through all those strength and conditioning sessions and lectures on how we program and structure athletes training. Welcome back to Sika and welcome back to Sika Strength. This is S&C Coaches React. Today we're reacting to Femke Bol, who is a Dutch athlete. She's hailing from the Netherlands and she is one of the greatest track and field athletes currently doing her thing. She has multiple indoor and European championships. She has the second fastest time in the 400 meter hurdles, but she also holds the current world record in the 400 meter indoor or short track running foot race. Woo! One thing I would like to remind everyone of is, obviously, when we're doing these S&C Coach Reacts, we're not criticizing Femke herself. It's not saying, oh, Femke is doing this right or wrong. We're not saying she should change this in her training. Rather, she is a good template for athletes in a similar condition and explaining what's going on. So obviously, we don't have context on most of these things. And the context doesn't particularly matter. What we're focusing on is what might this be in training? What might use this be for an athlete in their training? So this is for people watching, not so much Femke herself, just in case anyone's like, oh my god, you said that about my favorite running girl.
So up first here we have some front squats, and there's a couple of things about these front squats that make them noteworthy and make them worth talking about. So firstly, really good front squats, an incredibly good depth on those front squats. Now, I know some of you watching might be weightlifters, or you might just lift weights in the gym recreationally, and you'll say, oh, I can kind of squat to that depth, or I usually squat below parallel in a similar fashion to this. In the world of track and field, and particularly in the speed sports, we rarely see athletes squatting this deep, and particularly for the front squat, we rarely see them going this deep. The second thing we see is that we see a hip band or a band around her knees that's essentially squeezing her knees in and forcing her to use her glutes to pull her knees out to the side. So a lot of you will be really familiar with the common failure method on squats of valgus knee rotation, or the two knees tilting in from the sides. This is particularly prevalent in female populations due to a higher Q angle. So here we see that band being used. It's basically an active kinesthetic cue. It gives her a small bit more load, so her glutes have to work harder to pull those knees out to the side and keep her knees tracking straight over her toes.
So one of the things you might think about when we're talking about depth is a lot of athletes are concerned about ankle rigidity, ankle flexibility or lack of flexibility, and sometimes it's trained. It's a point of contention among coaches and athletes about what's a better method of trying to maintain that rigid ankle. The important thing to remember is that you don't have to have inflexible ankles to be able to have a rigid foot. So it sometimes might be confused with ankles or athletes having poor dorsiflexion and their ability to transfer force, but there's nothing stopping you having a full range of motion and then being able to have a rigid ankle and rigid foot, and those tendons being rigid when they need to in relation to that plantar flexion and dorsiflexion when it's needed. So having full range of motion is definitely better. So don't stray away. What you actually do see sometimes from athletes straying away from increasing their ankle range of motion or doing squats when it might increase their range of motion, it's that they are not mutually exclusive. You can have a rigid ankle when needed and also a flexible ankle when needed. Now, there's a good argument, a very solid argument to be made for elastic tendons being far better for applying force. Part of the stretch shortening cycle is the elasticity of those tendons recoiling and allowing you to apply more force. And so having stretchier tendons in the foot and ankle and the calf is very important for that.
Yeah, it's actually, there's a few interesting parallels from other sports that come in here, and rugby or American football players are one very similar case. And when we look at their shoulders, so a lot of time those shoulders will be internally rotated. This happens in the combat sports as well, and they'll have a lack of external rotation in their shoulders. It's not necessarily that you should have a lack of external rotation in your shoulders, or in this case, a lack of dorsiflexion in your ankles. It's just that most of your specific training pushes you towards that, and it's not necessarily a bad thing if you have it.
So we can see in the second clip here, this is just a clip from her Instagram story talking about how the deep front squats are hard for her, but she's happy with the weight and the improvement on that. So it's obviously something that she's not afraid of to train full range of motion. So the full range of motion argument in track and field is quite interesting, and there's a lot of good arguments to be made from both sides, but it's of our opinion that it's best to hedge your bets. So train full range of motion. Specifically what we're talking about here is lower body training. So when it comes to the upper body in track and field, it's often something that's either left behind or only trained when needed. But when it comes to the lower body, there's a lot of strong arguments. And specifically when it comes to coaches who are specifically focused on vertical jumping, where they focus in heavily on half or quarter squats. Now, we have obviously defended half and quarter squats in the past, but there's very good arguments to be made that full range of motion squats and full range of motion lower body exercises are very, very important. And there's a lot of inferences you could make, both from a logical sense and from simply coaching a lot of athletes and seeing what's worked best for those. And we see that it's best to put a large amount of your training into that full range of motion of squat. Now for her, this is obviously that full range of motion. This is probably as deep as she can get, so that's as relevant as it gets for her. But for other people, for rugby players, sprinters, track and field, anyone who is a track and field athlete or a power athlete or trying to improve their sports performance, most of the training done with a full range of motion squat, when it's possible to do, is incredibly beneficial. You're hedging your bets because if you train the full range of motion, you are getting the full length of motion in that muscle, in those joints. You're also passing through that partial range of motion you'll be training, so you're also training from that. You're also getting the elasticity of the tendons. You're preparing those tendons for heavy loads under a full range of motion. You're stretching those tendons longer, which we just talked about is incredibly beneficial for the stretch shortening cycle. There's also a very good argument to be made, and there's some inferences in regards to vertical jump height, counter movement jump, broad jump being strongly related with muscle size. So force and power output is strongly related with muscle size and specific muscle groups in the quads. Then we can take the inference from that and continue it on with full range of motion as training is primarily best for hypertrophy work. Now there's some arguments about that, but there's a large agreement among experts and the research that full range of motion training is the best way of gathering that. So we could take that and go from coaches, and while we might always have to rely on the scientific research, we can go, okay, we've got this good evidence, we've done this with athletes, and we can say to ourselves, when possible and when it makes sense, full squats are very, very useful. That doesn't mean you can't do partial squats, is a big thing. So sometimes there's this argument that I only do one or the other, but there's no reason that you can't do mostly of one and then add in or supplement with that secondary exercise. So you spend your off season, for example, doing full range of motion squats, and then the in season you might do some more full range of motion squats, but you might also add in an additional day where you do some half squats or maybe box squats or touching the box as a way of ensuring that you're covering those bases in the event that a plethora of research comes out, which I don't think it will, that half squats are the best by far.
Yeah, one last thing on the squats here, and particularly in Femke's case. So most of us watching here will do some sort of squat, whether you're lifting, whether you're an athlete, whatever it is, you're going to be squatting at some point in the next week, more than likely. Now, a lot of us, particularly a lot of us taller people, will use the excuse that, oh, I'm not well built for squatting, so my squat doesn't look very good, or I have very long legs, or I'm taller than whatever height, so my squat doesn't look very good. In this case, Femke is very long-legged, so longer legs compared to shorter torso, and she's 6 foot tall. So for a female in particular, her proportions are not made for great squatting, yet here you see very, very good squat form. So there is no excuse for you. There's no excuse for any of us. We should be striving for that better squat form all the time.
And again, it's important, remember, is that there's no negative outcome. There's no perceivable outcome from full range of motion squats for your performance. There's no point where, other than short-term fatigue, which would play into even half squats as well, or quarter squats, is that comes from full range of motion squatting, or whatever full range of motion means for your own training. Now moving on, we have got quite a few heavy hang power cleans or block power cleans or power cleans from the floor from Femke here. So just as Dara said, she's 6 foot, 65 kilos, and the power cleans she does by and large are very, very good. Now there's one maybe iffy one, which we'll get to in a second, but by and large, the quality of her power cleans are great for an athlete. She's catching them pretty high, she's racking the barbell, she's very importantly not jumping very wide, she's jumping certainly into her catch stance if she did need to catch that, and the weights are very, very heavy relative to body weight when you're looking for that performance output using the Olympic lifts. So one of the benefits, or the main benefits when we're using the Olympic lifts, is something that's known as speed strength. But what we're really focusing on in the Olympic lifts is contraction of muscles, relaxation of those muscles, and then contraction again. So we kind of have this peak, this trough, and this peak again. And what we want to be able to do, especially if someone trying to run really fast in 400 meters, is contract really strongly, get that contraction really high, and then decrease the time between that peak and that trough, as quickly as possible, but have that contraction incredibly high again after. So cycling through these contractions and relaxation of those muscles. And the power clean is incredibly useful for that. So we have the pulling motion where we're contracting, we have the shifting of the knees back, we have the extension. So we're contracting, relaxing, different sets of muscle groups. We're contracting aggressively in that extension, then we're relaxing to get underneath the barbell. Most of those muscle groups need to relax as we pull ourselves down, and then we're contracting again really aggressively in that catch position.
Yeah, it's that in that contraction and relaxation phase is where the main argument for and against the Olympic lifts and training kind of sits. So a lot of the time people will say, oh, there's no need for the Olympic lifts, or in certain videos they'll say there's too high a risk of injury to use the Olympic lifts. But the Olympic lifts do give you that far shortened distance between that peak and the trough, more so than any other weight. So in this case, we have power cleans and hang power cleans. If we're to compare that movement to something that might be equally as beneficial using similar motor groups and similar levels of force, you might be doing a hex bar jump, or you might be doing some sort of kettlebell swing. So very fast hip opening, very fast knee opening. You're basically trying to extend upwards as quickly as possible. Now, the negative for both of those things is that you're basically going to go through a far longer amortization phase. So amortization is as your muscle is lengthening out, as you're sitting down into the squat, as you're catching the barbell. The amortization phase is basically stopping that lengthening and bringing the muscle to a full stop. So you're lengthening out, you're in the eccentric loading phase, and you're trying to stop yourself from moving. Now, in the case of a hex bar deadlift, the problem is that amortization phase usually is hampered somewhat by foot placement and somewhat by our grip. So because that hex bar is sitting in both of our hands, we get that immediate jolt and immediate drop down from the shoulders, which isn't an ideal position, and our body actually inhibits us being able to put a lot of force into it. Now, this is very similar with the kettlebell swing, where we're bringing the kettlebell back down to our hip, and our body is working hard against that to basically stop our hips from closing over too much. The big advantage with the power clean is the bar's on our shoulders. The bar's in a very, very strong position. You'll see here good high elbows on most of these reps, and you can put a lot of force in during that amortization phase to make that second contraction even harder. Now, before we move on from the power cleans and hang power cleans, a really interesting fact here, and it's something that pops up over and over again in the comments and even in the comments of these videos, is the use of straps for power cleans, hang power cleans, cleans from blocks, whatever they are. And I think it's particularly apt in the case of an athlete of this level of experience that we address this point. So in this case, Femke is using lasso style straps. You typically see these being used by powerlifters and bodybuilders more so than weightlifters. They're basically allowing her to hold onto the bar without a massive amount of grip force or grip fatigue coming into it, and put the most amount of force into that bar. Now, the negative of using these straps is that we might have an increased risk of injury if that front rack position isn't perfect when she catches the bar, or in the unlikely case that she falls and is unable to accept that barbell. We can have things like elbows contacting knees or elbows contacting floor. Obviously, if we're tied into the bar, there is a certain risk there. Now, I mentioned Femke's level of experience, and definitely when we look at these videos and we look at the relative weights being used, it's clear she is not an inexperienced athlete with the power cleans. She's doing massive weights here. She's clearly done a lot of power cleans in the past, and to be honest, I think that risk factor is drastically lower in her case than it might be for some athletes who don't do them quite as much.
So it is very important that if you're using straps in power cleans, it's for lighter working weights. For most people, unless you are supremely confident and you have a very good coach who can teach you them, whether a weightlifting coach or an S&C coach, that you don't use straps, certainly not lasso style straps. So preferably get weightlifting straps, something that are easy, so single loop straps. In terms of maybe Ironmind, Luz Arjun, Weightlifting House, all these sell very, very good, useful weightlifting straps. So it can be dangerous. Weightlifters have broken their wrists doing that. There was a very famous case of an American weightlifter about 20 odd years ago now who broke both his wrists. He was training in the National Training Center, the Olympic Training Center for USA weightlifting, and he was doing hang cleans, fell over backwards. Both his wrists got pain, then he broke both his wrists, and he subsequently couldn't wipe his own butt when he was pooping. So it was a very serious injury. There's a video out there, and it's horrible. But the case to be made is that if you're doing super heavy attempts in, as a track and field athlete or as an athlete in general, it's best not to use the straps. To be honest, in general, there's not a great case to be made for going super heavy in the Olympic lifts, in the hang power clean or the block clean very, very frequently. Most often than not, the working weights are sufficient themselves to give you that benefits to your power capacity, your rate of force development. Now, you do need to increase the weight to a certain extent, and in this case, you're kind of around that 1.5 times body weight, which generally seems to be what, either if you're doing clean pulls or power cleans, seem to give you most of the benefits. And after that, then it's certainly useful, but it's a very diminishing return on the amount of work you need to do to get, for example, a double body weight power clean, which would be 125 or 130 kilos in this stage. Huge amount of work for not a huge amount of return compared to that 1.5 to 2 times body weight. So generally, if you get to that 1.5 times body weight power clean as an athlete for most sports, unless you're maybe a thrower, maybe you're a shot put thrower or a discus thrower, you're probably not going to get a huge amount more benefit. It is important to say you will get some more benefit, obviously, if you can move that heavyweight faster, but it's a pretty diminishing returns, and you'd probably get more benefit just by practicing your sport more often, unless you're supremely good. Now, some people can get to that double body weight power clean no problem, but if you're working hard and it's been 5 years and you're at the 1.5, then you've probably, you've gotten a lot of the benefit from the power cleans. So by and large, that one video from the power clean wasn't great, but most of the videos we see of Femke doing our power cleans are fantastic. Not a wide jump, good rack position, catching it very, very high, hips are back a little bit, chest are upright. There's nothing wrong except for that one heavier one, which would make you, cringe a little bit as a weightlifting coach or concerned for that. She's still getting the benefit from the exercise. It's just that it might be a little bit dangerous, and when you can see what happened, there is a case to be made for that.
In the next video here, we see a very standard running S&C video, or generally speaking, a very standard track and field S&C video. So what we have here is a lot of single leg work. We have single leg work mainly working across 2 or 3 different aspects of that force velocity curve. And just as it's on our screen now, let's start off talking about this single leg RDL. So single leg RDLs are massively beneficial for running athletes. They're massively beneficial for a couple of reasons though. The first thing is we're building very, very good strength in the hamstrings, and most importantly, we're building strength in the hamstrings across the entire range of motion. So particularly in this case, when it's a barbell being used rather than a single kettlebell or a dumbbell, we're making sure that barbell is level the entire time. Sometimes when we see athletes with a single implement, so kettlebell or dumbbell, and they have it in the non-standing, so the opposite side to their standing leg, they're holding it, they can tend to reach down a small little bit. We'll get a little bit of hip shift, or we'll get a little bit of shoulder tilt, which makes it look like the range of motion is more than it is. And also it'll make it look like they're more balanced than they are, when in fact they might not be. So the barbell is the ultimate form for this, particularly when we're looking at balance and getting full range of motion. Now, the second reason the single leg RDL is so beneficial for the running athletes is that it's going to build a massive amount of balance and proprioceptive awareness for their legs, particularly their ankle, knee and hip joints. So understanding when they're tilted forward, what their back leg is doing, what their standing leg is doing, having that balance when they're under load to be able to control themselves is just so massively beneficial, not only for injury prevention, but also for absolute performance on the track.
So single leg training and bilateral training is, again, that's sometimes contentious. There was a very famous coach before, if any of you have been around for a while, who only trained his American football players with single leg stuff. I believe he's still active. Now, most people will think that's a bit silly. So again, it's best to hedge your bets with bilateral training, like for example the back squat or the front squat, and unilateral training like these RDLs or those Bulgarian split squats. It only makes sense as a runner when you are very actively spending most of your time or all of your time running on one leg at a time. It makes perfect sense to train each leg individually as predominantly as possible. So with split squats, Bulgarian split squats, front foot elevated split squats, as much as you possibly can, while still trying to increase the weight on those particular movements. Now, there's a good benefit then from the bilateral movements, because we can move heavier weights, and ultimately, if we can move a heavy weight through full range of motion, we're getting a great stimulus on the athlete as a whole. So there's a great benefit to that. The heavier weights we produce, or the heavier weights we move, the more force we're producing. Force is obviously incredibly important part of the equation for rate of force development. So it is super important in this context. But then trying to minimize asymmetries between limbs is quite important. And there's a lot of good research emerging, specifically over the last couple of years, showing that once you get beyond a certain threshold of discrepancy from side to side, whether that's in range of motion or strength or force output, that you do start to see a higher chance of injuries. That does make sense. Now, some people will argue with this and say that, athletes have huge asymmetries, and that might be the case. And if you look at some of the research on track and field athletes, some of the Europeans, you can see sometimes up to a 20%, up to 20 centimeter difference from side to side in reach in the stride. Now, that's the large end of the spectrum, but it does let us know that there's a certain threshold of unilateral discrepancy or asymmetry that is acceptable. But when we go beyond that, then we start to see some differences. So it only makes sense, again, for you to hedge your bets. It doesn't take that much work to do a little bit of extra mobility work from side to side, a little bit of unilateral mobility work, a little bit of unilateral strength work. It's not a killer. There's no reason to ignore those. And I think sometimes we see that where it's like, it doesn't matter. That's not a good illogical inference, in my opinion, but also it doesn't cost you anything to do 8 sets of split squats a week. It's a very low intensive way of correcting that. Then we've got a very, very interesting exercise, and you'll have seen me doing it recently in my training vlogs if you've been watching. It's these explosive single leg box step-ups. Now, I'm certainly not as repeatedly powerful as hers on these, but the idea behind these is that, again, it's a unilateral training exercise. You're running one leg per time like a horse. Your limbs are leaving the ground. So when you're doing these, you are jumping as repeatedly as possible. So it's like that contraction relaxation of the power clean. You're cycling through that movement as you're contracting, you're relaxing in the air, then you're contracting again. And that is one of the benefits of plyometric stuff compared to power cleans, is that you can get a higher number of repetitions of this contraction and relaxation compared to, you're not going to do sets of 5 in terms of hang power cleans at a meaningful weight, but you can do a lot more sets. And it's one of the arguments people use against Olympic lifts for plyometric training, is that you can get more quality repetitions in. Our argument again is hedge your bets and do both of them. So have your power cleans if you can do them, and then have your very intelligent plyometric work in. These single leg stuff, very, very useful again for that reason, whereas we want to train each one of those as intuitively as possible. You want to build the best mind-muscle connection and intramuscular coordination with each individual limb and give yourself the best opportunity to be the most complete athlete. And a couple of sets of single leg explosive step-ups is a very, very simple way of doing that.
The last thing about this session, and Owen mentioned the word repetitions earlier, is the working weights and the reps she's doing on each of these. One of the most common issues we see in running and in athletics programs, generally speaking, is they are far too high on the reps, and they're trying to emulate the work capacity things they're doing on the track in the gym. So they're doing sets of 15, sets of 20, maybe 3 minutes of squatting fully or whatever it is. In all cases, you are better to do your high force work, then do your speed strength work, and then do your work capacity work or whatever it is out on the side. Don't try and emulate your sport in the gym. In this case, we see Femke doing mostly sets of 4. We see some sets of 3, and in later videos, we'll see sets of kind of 5. And the weight is heavy enough where she's putting a lot of force in. You'll see she's having to work hard to lock out that leg. And in all cases here, it's not a kind of work capacity piece that she's doing in the gym. She's doing her strength and power work.
So in this particular case, we have an interesting exercise that we see quite frequently happening with track and field athletes, specifically people running or have some form of running in their endeavour and their sport. And it's, to be honest, not an exercise that we would love hugely or would be really using in the athlete's position. So what they're training is hip extension, so getting the knee behind the hip, and then they're bringing that into hip flexion, so similar maybe to a running stride, although largely exaggerated. Now again, like we just talked about, it does make sense to train and exercise through a full range of motion, but for example in this case she's 55 kilos on her back, but the leg that she's actually moving through that range of motion, say the right leg, isn't really getting any additional benefit from that load. Now you might see people doing hip flexion with ankle weights or against a resistance band, which makes very good sense. But in this case, it's probably the leg that is standing, her left leg, is probably actually getting more of the training load. There's nothing really negative about this exercise. It's marginally beneficial maybe. Again, obviously in the context of Femke, Femke have some kind of context in our training and specific use, so obviously we're always along for that. But in general, it's something we see quite frequently, but it's not something we would ever use realistically unless there was a super specific case. But it is a common exercise, so we did want to leave it in without harping on the issue too much.
In this next training video, we see a brief excerpt of a plyometric session, or maybe it's a track warm-up or something along those lines. Now, there's two exercises here that really interest me. The first one is the two-legged bunny hops over the hurdles. These are massively beneficial, and these are beneficial outside of just the running sport. So no matter what you're doing, no matter what sport it is, if you're trying to be powerful, these kind of bounds where we have a set height we have to hit each time, we have a set distance we have to go each time, do combine those aspects of triple extension, but also that skill we get from being able to jump, tuck our legs up over a hurdle or a box, and then land effectively. Now, for most of us watching this when we're starting plyometrics, it's the actual landing mechanics is where we'll have to do a massive amount of our work. So we'll have to actually learn the skills of landing. You'll see multiple stages of learning landing mechanics in places like the UKSCA or in the NSCA workbooks. But landing mechanics essentially make sure you can go from that heightened position, accept that load, and be in a safe position when you come back down. So typically, if we see people slamming down onto the floor, or we see valgus knee rotation, or we see any bending of the back when we're landing, these are kind of red flags that pop up straight away. Now, the use of the hurdles and the use of this many hurdles in a row is definitely only for the advanced athletes. It's athletes who are onto their kind of third or fourth stage plyometrics, but they are so valuable in terms of becoming a more robust athlete overall. The second exercise then are those long single-legged bounds or those exaggerated strides. Now, we see this being used in the coaching of sprinting, not just in the use of plyometrics to become more powerful or more explosive, but also as a physical coaching cue or a coaching tool that athletes could use. So maybe if an athlete isn't truly extending their stride during their maximum phase or maximum speed phase, they can be very valuable. Also, if you have an athlete with asymmetries from side to side in their stride, they can be valuable. But most of the time we see them being used in a plyometric training circumstance.
So lastly here, we have got a series of data collection tests on an athlete, and you'll see a lot of national team athletes will go through some form of this testing, and very often you'll see a couple of similar tests. So the first one we have is the Wingate test, which is generally looked at as a power output test, and then we've got the VO2 max test, so your kind of efficiency with oxygen. The really important thing here is that while you may not have access to a VO2 max test, or probably could get something similar to the Wingate test, is that reproducibility of the method that you're measuring is the most important thing. So the way you're measuring it is the really important thing. So you might make the argument here that, and some sports science have made that argument, is that the Wingate test, for example, for runners isn't very useful. But the argument we would make is that if you're doing it consistently season on season, or at those points where you know it makes sense, so maybe you might do your Wingate test or your VO2 max test at the start of the season, then you're start of your off season, you finish your off season, you test it again, then you go through your season and you get your different time points. And over a couple of years, or however frequently you do that, you've got some valuable data, so you can look at a broad scale training method. Because you can be sure that in Femke's case, she's looking Olympics 4-year training cycle. She's not looking season to season, or not specifically just looking season to season. She's probably thinking, or her coaches are thinking, over the course of her career. And it's very useful to get some objective, or as objective data as we can make it. And one of the ways of making that data collection objective is just by making the testing method consistent. So even though she's a runner, it doesn't really matter that much as long as she's using the same style of testing. Now, you'll see in the VO2 max that she is testing it on the treadmill, which is definitely more applicable. And obviously, as anyone knows, or any students who've done sports science or anything like that, you've probably been forced to take part in the VO2 max test, or more likely a Wingate test, and you might have gotten sick after. But it is something that is very useful to have in your training. It does obviously present a huge amount of acute fatigue, which will dissipate in a few days. But if you can do that at the right points in your training, but it doesn't have to look like a VO2 max in a lab. It can be something like you get body fat percentage, you get a DEXA scan if possible. They're getting more common. You look at bar speed for certain weights. You might get a velocity tracker. Maybe you can test your certain plyometric jumps, whatever it is. So getting data is very, very useful. Now, the important thing is obviously you don't get obsessed with that data and how it affects your training and why you should change your training to affect that. If you're on pitch, or you're running, or you're on track, performance is going well, then you're all rosy. But having that data is very, very useful when you're trying to problem solve, or if you're trying to see you're in the right trajectory.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is on that data, these specific time points over the course of your season or over the course of a training cycle are the most important tested. So a lot of us will wear trackers, or we might have some kind of real-time data accumulation. That stuff really isn't as beneficial. The fluctuations we see from day to day, a lot of the time people will put a lot of weight on those, our recovery scores or our sleep quality score, whatever it is. We are much more along the lines of off-season testing, pre-season testing, in-season testing, post-season testing. A couple of data points across the course of those are going to be so much more valuable than any kind of wearable tracker will ever be able to give you.
One of the comments says heels never. World record holding 400 meters. Heels. Oh my God. So thanks for watching this S&C Coaches React. Please do leave athletes you want us to look at any sport. A lot of people have been asking for swimming and fencing lately. So if you have any good athletes in that, a couple of judo athletes coming, do please leave those in the comments. Specifically if you know they have some amount of training on their Instagram or their YouTube. It doesn't have to be a whole load, but it has to be sufficient for us to get a general idea of something going on and talking points. So very much enjoying doing these. So please do leave them in the comments. Remember, check out the S&C camp in May, or check out the Sika Strength app, where you can check out our off-season program. Maybe you need to improve your leg strength, so you run the back squat program. Whole host of options available over there, iOS and Android. Thanks for watching.